The design that's shown on this image here is not necessarily what people want to see, but they understand that this was a concept in nature, more looking at just the idea of spanning the street. The discussion was this would be great as a possible connection to the recreation community center, as well as the possible Secrets of the Sea aquarium that may go in, and also serving just as a gateway for drivers coming into the community. Could be a place where banners are hung, an entry sign, people getting to know what's actually happening in the community. So this was something that was very well received by the community. Now I want to get into a little bit more into some of what those finer grained ingredients are, the streetscape details. We showed a plant palette, a landscape palette that was intended to really be able to withstand the rain and the wind that you get here in St. Pete Beach. People were generally okay with this palette, with some exception or some discussion of really focusing in on the native plants. So not just plants that thrive here, but particularly plants that are also native to the local area. So there's some comments here on maybe trying to tweak that a little bit so we have a little bit more of a focus on native plants. And adding more trees in general was also another comment. This was an example of some of the possible recommended streetscape furnishings, so benches, lights, trash receptacles, some whimsical sort of bike racks that are in more of a fish and a sea life type of shape. The idea being that bicycle racks can really be a form of public art and serve as something that's really fun for the community and setting a design tone. The bike racks were fairly well received as well. The bench we had a lot of discussion around. Some people liked it, many people didn't. Also discussion of whether that was inappropriate or whether we wanted to see a consistent bench in the downtown area or something different. So there's some possibly more discussion that might need to happen around the ideas of a bench, or we bring back a few different options to include into the final concept for consideration as you move into that phase of the development. So having a couple choices is not a bad thing in a vision plan. Also during the design week in November, a lot of discussion was about how do we look at the sidewalks themselves as a potential canvas for something in order to really create a special place and a special there, if you will. One of the things we like to talk about is when people are in a downtown district or going somewhere that they're constantly discovering something, a sense of visual treats everywhere you move through the district. And one of the ideas here was the idea of using sea glass. So whether that is sprinkling seagrass as an aggregate into the concrete so that the concrete has that sort of glass shimmer, or creating something that's more of an artistic element that perhaps in this, as we're showing here, could be the idea of flip-flops inlaid into the sidewalk that would have the same iridescent sea glass type of a look, so incorporating that in. And one of the comments that came out last night were fairly in favor of these types of concepts, with some recommendation that maybe we even look at involving further the arts community into what actually is inlaid into the sidewalk. So maybe building on this idea, but having some community workshops and maybe art contests even, or efforts to really say, what do you want to see here? How can we make that a part of each block being unique and different? Another element that was discussed was the idea of potentially even scoring the concrete and coloring the concrete in a way that emulates a boardwalk, whether that's in the newer end, the west and east end, or even along the core. But there's lots of really neat things you can do with the sidewalk itself so that it's not just a traditional concept. We also looked at opportunities for shade and shelter. And this is just an example or a sample showing where existing canopies or arcades, walkways are right now in existing buildings on the Corey Avenue area in particular. And this is a graphic showing in green where there are easy additions to existing buildings for canopies or arcades. And the thought of being potential freestanding structures where you see the purple, or potential arcades that could be added to infill buildings. This was a quick example of one of those freestanding shade structures. The notion here being the Lexington glass on the top would have a postcard type of design. The light could shine through, and it would be a freestanding type of shade structure. From the workshop last night, most of the folks were not really in favor of this concept, thought it was a little bit maybe too much for the streetscape, a little bit too many things going on, particularly with the colors and the sidewalk and something like this happening as well. Still strongly in favor of shade and shelter from the building standpoint, arcades and awnings, and potentially maybe using this type of a design at the bus stops, but not as a general feature throughout the downtown core. So then we spent a little bit of time talking more about the couplet. As you know, the couplet is intended to bring people around, divert traffic, or change the configuration of traffic to kind of have people driving down 75th, down Gulf Boulevard, around on 73rd, and then back up again on going past it, depending on which way you're coming through. So what we wanted to show was a little bit more detail on what the couplet design actually would look like if it was actually implemented. So this is an example of Gulf Boulevard and 75th as it is right now. Roughly, building face to building face is approximately 80 feet with 5 travel lanes, including the turn lane in the middle. This is a typical section of what 75th or 75th and Gulf could look like with the couplet implemented. And I'll show a site plan level in just a moment as well. So we've got the planted divider separating the one slower travel lane that we're calling the city aisle and a parallel parking, and 2 lanes that would be on the outskirts that would be moving a little bit faster, yet only 25 miles an hour, so not extremely fast. That would also be able to have an adjoining bike lane and some landscape buffer on both sides of the street, protecting the pedestrians. One of the comments last night was one to look at maybe doing this as something that's called a cycle track instead. So where you see the sidewalk with pedestrians, the landscape buffer, and the bike lane is actually shifting that so that the bicycle is next to the pedestrians, still below the curb, and then the landscaping is between the cyclist and the automobiles, which then provides even more of a buffer for the cyclist, making cycling much more amenable on that street as well. So this is looking down in plan view. You can see the landscaped divider through the middle. It's hard to have a pointer here. Working down at the middle of the road there with the 2 travel lanes on the north side or on the west side, depending on which street you're looking at. The planted buffer, the dedicated bike lane, and the interior parallel parking. One of the greater benefits of this design is the idea of the shortened crossing distance for the pedestrian. So right now, a pedestrian is crossing the street either at 75th or at Gulf and crossing 5 lanes of travel going in 2 different directions. With the couplet, instead, that person would be traveling over 1 lane, going in 1 direction, so looking in 1 direction, stopping at that landscaped buffer, and then traveling across another 2 lanes, again, only looking in 1 direction to cross. So the distance that they're crossing is shorter, and the potential conflicts with the automobile tend to be less as well. So that's kind of the concept of the couplet.
Meg, could I ask you a question?